When it comes to the countless files stored on an iPhone, there are really only 4 that are critical to understanding this topic. The first is something called mobilesafari.plist, which is a big XML text file that Safari, iOS's native web browser, uses to track a bunch of miscellaneous information. One such piece of information stored in this document is a list of recent searches conducted by the user. Whenever you type a search directly into Safari's native search bar, the search term you entered, as well as the time that you conducted the search, is saved inside of this plist file within a list called Recent Web Searches. Now, as you can see, viewing these files normally can be pretty overwhelming and annoying. So rather than show all this garbage to you the entire time I'm going through this demonstration, what I'm going to be doing is creating my own visuals to represent the relevant data in these files, omitting all of the unimportant information and laying it all out in a much more digestible format, with the end goal of having something that looks like this being turned into something that looks like this. Now, I do want to make it clear, though, that simply due to the fact that this kind of testing of all of these different use cases takes a ton of time, with lots of taking notes, refreshing database tables, opening and closing files, and all kinds of other stuff in between, as well as my reformatting all of the data for display purposes anyway, there's really no practical reason to try to do this quote-unquote live, so I didn't. All of the data and visuals are here to support my summarizing the results of my testing. It's not the actual recordings of the real testing that I did, and trust me, you wouldn't want to see that anyway. I'm simply trying to make it so all of the laymen out there, which is probably 95% of the audience, can follow along easily without getting lost or overwhelmed. Now, by default, Safari takes the search terms you enter into its native search bar and effectively conducts that search in Google on your behalf, by taking what you typed and constructing a Google search URL with it. It does this by tacking your search terms onto the end of a Google URL along with some special formatting. These searches are done using the base path of google.com/search, and then a question mark is added, acting as a separator between the base path and the parameters of the request, with the most basic search only requiring the query parameter, indicated by the letter Q. And because properly formatted URLs can't have spaces in them, the spaces in your search query are replaced with plus signs. So when you type this query into Safari's native search bar, the query is both saved in mobilesafari.plist, as well as used to generate the Google search URL that the browser will attempt to navigate to. Which brings us to our next relevant file, history.db. History.db is exactly what it sounds like, a database of information related to your browser history. Now, inside of this database, there's a table called history_visits, which represents all of the web pages that you visit. So let's take a look at how this database and our recent web searches behave together. And for the sake of this demo, let's assume that each web page takes 2 seconds to load after we conduct our search. Every time we make a search, the search term is added to our plist, and during the interim period between submitting the search, but prior to the page actually loading, there's no corresponding history item in the database. That is until 2 seconds later when the web page is finally done loading, at which point the new entry is added to the history visits table. Now note here the small discrepancy between the timestamps for the search terms in our plist and the history items in the database, which is of course expected given that in the real world it takes time for things to load. And of course, the amount of time is variable based on if you're connected to Wi-Fi, have poor service, or even in some cases have no reception at all. Now in that case, let's assume that Safari just gave up after 30 seconds of trying to load the page and it timed out. Not only would there be a 30-second discrepancy between the search time and the history time, but when the page finally stopped trying to load altogether and the error page is displayed, the title associated with the corresponding history item will reflect that error. Now, a really important thing to note here is that this table has an ID field, and this field is what's known as an auto-incrementing integer primary key, which is a fancy way of saying that every ID is unique within this table, and every time a new record is created, the ID value is automatically made 1 larger than the last one it created. And this becomes particularly relevant when we talk about deleting some or all of our Safari history. Now, there's really only 3 distinct categories, so to speak, when it comes to deleting browser history within Safari. First, you can open up your history and selectively delete 1 or more of the individual items. Let's say we opened up our Safari history and deleted items 2, 4, and 10 from the list. Our resulting history table would be updated to look like this. Now, if you were to then go load up another page, the record for that page would be created with ID number 11, because the last ID it created was 10 and this value has to be unique, which includes deleted records. Now, of course, this leaves us with an obvious gap in IDs, a clear and unavoidable indication that 1 or more records were deleted from our browser history, and the same kind of behavior exists when you delete items in batches as well. One example of which being that we can choose to delete our history from, say, only today, which would leave us with a history like this. If we were then to load up one more page, given that the most recent record created was ID 11, The new record would be 12, again leaving us with another obvious gap in history. Now, one more important thing to note here is that despite one or more of these pages being removed from our history database, none of the corresponding searches were removed from the recent web searches in mobilesafari.plist. Remember that the search is distinct from the loading of the web page. Now, when it comes to deleting history, there's one edge case, and that's if we choose to clear our entire browsing history. Safari treats this a little bit differently and basically kicks off a process that wipes far more than just your history items. It clears cache data, cookies, local search information, which includes our plist, and probably more. Although again, if we were to load up another page, the ID of the associated history visit would continue right where it left off, again being a clear indication that deletion of history occurred at some time prior. Now all of that brings us to our last two relevant files that just happen to be very closely related, starting with browserstate.db. This is another database file that contains various sets of information related to the state of the browser, like the windows, tabs, or groups of tabs that are contained inside of it, and it's the tabs table that we care about in this case. This table tracks the state of the tabs inside the browser, storing information like the order of the tabs, if the tab has private browsing enabled, and three other bits of information that are more relevant to this topic: the title, the URL, and something called the last viewed time. The title and URL are fairly self-explanatory. They represent the title and URL associated with the web page currently loaded in that tab. As you likely already know, you can navigate between any number of web pages within a single tab, but there's only ever one page loaded in that tab at any given time. So when we look at the title and URL associated with a given record in the tabs table, that tells us absolutely nothing about what or how many pages were previously loaded in that tab. We can't see the history behind this particular tab in this particular database table. This record is simply a snapshot of the most recent recorded state for that tab. Now, the last viewed time is frustratingly more nuanced, and that's primarily due to the name it was given and its behavior. Whether it's a variable, a function, or a database field, it's important to try to clearly and succinctly represent the meaning behind whatever it is you're creating when you're writing software by naming it something that will convey its purpose and function to anybody reading it. Whether that be other engineers that may be working on that code, or even you in the future, when you come back and are looking at the code you wrote and don't remember what you did. Anyone who's spent any amount of time writing software knows that naming things clearly and efficiently can be much harder than you'd expect. And anybody who's spent any extended period of time working with Apple software, reading Objective-C APIs, will know that this doesn't always happen. And yes, I'm looking at you. CM metadata format description create with metadata format description and metadata specifications. The last viewed time value is something commonly referred to as a timestamp, a number that represents a time and date, or specifically in this case, the number of seconds that has elapsed between that exact moment in time and an absolute reference date that Apple uses in much of its software, midnight on January 1st, 2001 UTC. This is what it looks like in the database, and this is what it looks like if you apply some formatting to it. I'll be displaying all timestamps in this format going forward, adjusted for my local time zone, so just be aware that while the underlying data is in a slightly different format, it all means the same thing. What makes this value particularly frustrating in this case is that despite its name, it doesn't actually refer to what you would reasonably expect it to, the timestamp the user last viewed the contents of that tab. As with many things in software, this value has a relatively short name, although its name doesn't fully encapsulate all of the underlying rules that govern when and why this value gets set. Let's dive into a few of the relevant use cases so we can try to reverse engineer both when the new records get created within the tabs table inside of browserstate.db, as well as when their corresponding last viewed time values get set, starting with a totally fresh instance of Safari. At 10:30 a.m., I launched Safari for the first time after having cleared all data from settings, which brought me to the default landing page for a new tab. Let's call this tab number 1. Now, the first thing to note here is that the browser state database hasn't even been created at this point. Interesting. Now at 10:31, I conduct a search within tab number 1, and still no browserstate.db. At 10:32, I click on the first link in the Google search results and load a Wikipedia page, and still no browserstate.db. At 10:33, I create a brand new tab number 2, and still nothing. At 10:34, I navigate to a previously saved favorited site. At 10:35, I pull down to refresh that site, and still nothing. At 10:36, I create tab number 3. And then at 10:37, I conducted one more search, and yet still nothing. At 10:38, I create tab number 4 and again load up a site for my favorites. Now at 10:39, I backrouted Safari without closing it, and then at 10:40, I opened it back up again. After all of this, browserstate.db still doesn't exist. That is until 1041, when I open up the tabs menu and I close tab number 4. So now we can see the database actually exists, and we see that this record contains the title and URL associated with the page that was loaded in it when it was closed, as well as a last viewed time that was set to 1038, which was the time that tab was originally created. Now, after creating that tab initially, I backgrounded Safari, brought it back to the foreground, displayed that tab again, opened the tab menu, and deleted the tab. Although it appears as though none of those things had any effect on the last viewed time for that tab, despite it being arguable that we did in fact view the contents of that tab multiple times after it was initially created. So we can already see that this last viewed time naming convention isn't exactly as accurate as we might think. Now so far, it seems as if records only get created for a given tab when the tab is closed, and the last viewed time for that tab is set when the tab is created. Let's continue and see if these simple rules hold true. Still on the tab screen from before, at 1043 I closed tab number 1, and as expected, a second record was added to the tabs table, this time with a timestamp of 1033. Weird, that's the time that tab number 2 was created. Now this confused me for a while until I did some further testing and started to get a bit of a handle on how it might work under the covers, but for now, let's keep going. Now at 1044 I switched to tab number 2. And if I closed tab number 2 after this point, this would have resulted in the associated record's last viewed time to have been updated. Although because we can only see records when they're deleted and we haven't deleted tab number 2 yet, we aren't able to see that now. And the same could be said for the first time we launched Safari and the first tab was created, as well as the moment that we created tab number 3. Now at 1045, I closed tab number 3, which resulted in a third record being created with the last viewed time associated to the time that I switched to tab number 2. I'm going to spare you all the details because it largely doesn't matter, but what I will say is that the setting of certain tabs' last viewed time values are related to how Safari manages its tabs, especially when the app is backgrounded and foregrounded and when the tabs list is open and you swap between tabs, with one specific outcome being that sometimes tabs can inherit the last viewed time from other tabs. Now it's this process that explains why tab number 3's last viewed time was exactly the time that we switched to tab number 2, which would have made it the active tab and would have updated its timestamp, and why tab number 1's last view time was precisely when tab number 2 was created. Now again, I have theories about how and why this happens, but that's too far into the weeds for now. So continuing on, at 1046 I force quit Safari and reopened it at 1047. I then waited over an hour until 1201, when I conducted a third and final search, and then at 1202 I closed that tab, leaving me with a final record with a last viewed time of 1047, which was the time that Safari was launched after being fully quit over an hour earlier. So, what are the main takeaways from all this? Well, this all started because I was trying to explain how last viewed time is a misnomer. It doesn't mean what you think it means, and I'm hoping now that it's clear exactly why I say that. The timestamp associated with these records inside of the tabs table is not merely updated every time the pages within that tab are viewed, as one might expect. You can view 1,000 pages within that tab, refreshing pages, opening and closing Safari, loading bookmarks and favorites, conducting searches, and as long as you don't force quit the app, create or switch between tabs, that value is never going to be updated. And then if you happen to do any combination of those particular behaviors, one or more of your tabs might have their last viewed time set to the last viewed time of one of your other tabs. And once again, therein lies the problem. Last viewed time is simply not a value we can easily or reliably link to the web page associated with that database record. The best example of this is the penultimate event that we recorded in my little test browser session, my third and final Google search. To the untrained eye, it would be obvious and reasonable to conclude that I made the search for test search 3 at 10:47 in the morning, but it just so happens that in this case, the obvious, reasonable conclusion is entirely incorrect. We all know now without a shadow of a doubt that I made that search at 12:01 in the afternoon, an hour and 14 minutes after this database record seems to indicate, and I'm hoping now that my point is starting to become clear. Now, there's one more relevant file I was going to talk about, browserstate.db-wall, but explaining what wall files are and how they work is just going to be too much for this video. While this information is obviously relevant, it doesn't actually change any of the underlying facts, so I'm going to spare you. For all intents and purposes, we can just treat browserstate.db-wall the same as if it was browserstate.db. You can either simply take my word for it, or you can educate yourself about all of the relevant details, as I have, at which point you'll undoubtedly come to the same conclusions. But if you happen to be someone knowledgeable about the relevant concepts, hopefully you'll understand that I'm obviously skipping and simplifying lots of relevant details for the sake of time. If you happen to disagree or have any questions, leave a comment and I'd be happy to discuss. Let's move on. There's a few relevant trial exhibits to look over, all containing familiar data that we've just gone over in one form or another, and most of them don't have titles or file names or any context surrounding them, so I'm going to do my best to quickly summarize what they each are. Exhibit 620 shows us a portion of Jennifer McCabe's browserstate.db file, and as you'll see, there's multiple copies of the same record, and that's because this is actually a composite of multiple versions of the same database table thrown together for the purpose of trial. Again, we can effectively ignore this, as well as some of the earlier and later records, and distill it down to something like this. Now, Exhibit 616 shows 3 specific items from mobilesafari.plist, representative of 3 Google search attempts, and 614 shows the browser history stored in history.db between a period of time just after midnight on January 29th until just about after 10 a.m. that morning. Now, Exhibit 617 was put together for trial to show the relationship between items in mobilesafari.plist and the corresponding history.db items. Given what we went through earlier, it should make perfect sense now that what we're seeing here are the searches that were typed into Safari's native search bar, followed by a second or less of loading time before the corresponding Google results page was displayed. Now, I've combined 614, 616, and 617 to produce a larger snapshot of the state of her mobilesafari.plist file and history.db. Obviously, I don't have access to the raw phone extraction data. All I'm working with is what was provided in trial exhibits. So of course there's bits and pieces of missing data here or there, but for all intents and purposes, this tells me everything I need to know. Now all of that finally brings us to Exhibit 615, the infamous Cellebrite report that allegedly shows that Jennifer McCabe made a Google search for Hoss Long to die in cold at 2:27 a.m. and then subsequently deleted it. Understanding the relationships between all of these files, coupled with an understanding of what each piece of information means, and not only how, but also when the data gets written, is the key to understanding how we know, to a very high degree of confidence, that this interpretation of this report is incorrect. Allow me to walk you through a theoretical timeline of events that perfectly explains all of the data that we see here, and is entirely consistent with this search never happening at 2:27 that morning. At 4:49 p.m. on the 27th of January, Jennifer McCabe Googled Raining Men, and 1 second later she was shown the search results for that search. 3 seconds later she was watching the Raining Men music video on YouTube, and then at some point after she likely force quit Safari. Now, based on other forensic information shown in the trial related to another file that I didn't really get into, knowledgec.db, it seems extremely likely that in the early seconds of 2:27 a.m. on January 29th, she was browsing the Hockomock Sports website, looking for information about youth hockey schedules, and then at some point decided to close a few of her old open tabs from prior browsing sessions, namely Eastern Bank at 2:27:33, a Hockomock Sports article at 2:27:36, and that Raining Men YouTube video at 2:27:38. This perfectly explains not only why these 3 records would have been shown on screen at those times, as indicated by what's shown in knowledgec, as well as why they'd have corresponding items inside of the browserstate.db at that exact same time. The tabs became active, updating their last view time, and the fact that these records exist here at all is indication that the tabs were closed. After going through and closing all of those tabs, she was eventually brought to the final tab that she would use that evening. And that tab would become Safari's active tab, having its last viewed time tracked as 2:27:40. After which, she likely searched a bit for the schedule information she was looking for earlier, backgrounded Safari, and then went to bed. Now, later that morning, just after 6:23 a.m., during all of the chaos that ensued on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road, regardless of whose idea it was or why, Jennifer McCabe opened up Safari from the background. This would have brought her to the same tab that she was browsing only 4 hours earlier, the tab that had last become active at 2:27:40 after closing all of those tabs. Now, because Safari was suspended in the background, it wasn't force quit, the last viewed time would not have been updated when she opened it later that morning, so it would have remained 2:27:40. Now, at 6:23:51, from within that exact same tab, she attempted to Google search how long to die in cold, mistyping it as how long TI die in CIKD. Now, we can see the associated search in mobilesafari.plist, but given that there's no history item showing the associated Google search results, that seems to indicate that the attempted search never actually completed. It didn't fail, which would have shown an error page, or succeed, which would have shown the search results. And this isn't at all surprising, given that she was standing out in the middle of a blizzard not connected to Wi-Fi. It very likely could have easily taken over 30 seconds to either load the page or to fail, but she didn't wait that long. 27 seconds after her initial search, at 6:24:18, she tried again, this time typing in Hoss Long to die in cold, once again adding the associated search to mobilesafari.plist, and once again appearing to never actually complete given the lack of an associated history item. Now, at some point while the page was still attempting to load, she probably gave up, closed the tab, and then put her phone away. Now, at the moment that she closed the tab, it was effectively in a state of limbo. It had that specific Google search URL associated with it because, remember, Safari knows how to construct that URL based on your search query, and it has a last viewed time associated with when that tab had become last active, 2:27:40 earlier that morning. And unlike every record we've seen thus far, it doesn't have any title associated with it, which is exactly what happens when a tab has started loading a new page but is unable to retrieve the associated HTML for that page, contained within which is the title tag, which is what tells the browser what to call the page and the tab. This is something that I was able to replicate in my testing, and is one more piece of evidence supporting the fact that those Google searches never actually successfully completed. Now, we also know, for multiple independent reasons, that not only did she not delete anything related to these searches from her history, she also would have never been able to. Firstly, because the search is never completed and the page is never loaded, nothing would have ever been added to her browser history, and it's the history visits inside of history.db that's what's used to populate your Safari history. So there would have been nothing for her to delete anyway. And secondly, recall that the ID values of the history database are unique and automatically increment. So because of this, we would be able to see any individual or batch deletion of browser history as a gap in the IDs, something that we don't see anywhere within the relevant range of time from just after midnight to after 10 a.m. So then, back to this report. Why does it seem to indicate that she made the Hoslong to Die in Cold search at 2:27:40 and then deleted it? Now, while the essence of the following explanation is absolutely true, I of course have to caveat this one last time by saying that this is a massively simplified summary. I'm more than happy to discuss any and all of the finer details with anybody, but I just don't feel the need to get into them all here. In a nutshell, the searched items report is something generated by Cellebrite at the request of an examiner, whether that's a digital forensics analyst or an investigating officer. Using the Cellebrite software, they provide a date range to search within, and then Cellebrite combs through all of the relevant files that it extracted from the phone, looking for records that it can identify as searches. Now, this process likely contains one or more heuristics for locating and identifying searches, but it for sure utilizes one in particular, and that's by examining any URLs in any of the records containing that pattern that we talked about earlier, the Google search query URL. If it finds anything it identifies as a search, it parses that URL and extracts the search terms and then displays it under the value column. And then it looks at the associated timestamp for that record, formats it in the desired format adjusted for the desired time zone, and displays that under the timestamp column. Now, whether or not a record is marked as deleted is not necessarily based on any actions that the user undertakes. The likely explanation in this case is, put simply, these databases work the way they do by utilizing massive amounts of redundancy. When changes are made, the entire database is effectively copied, with the latest changes applied to that new copy. Remember all these duplicate files? That's basically what we were looking at. This redundancy gives us the ability to roll back to specific points in the history of a database just in case there's some kind of database corruption, accidental insertion or deletions, that kind of thing. Now, when Cellebrite is doing its analysis, one of the things it does is examines the countless copies of the same database files within that history and compares them. And if it finds something that exists in a prior table that doesn't exist in a later table, it marks that item as deleted. Now, why and when different values get written to or removed from different copies of these tables is a mystery only the developers of Safari could tell us, but this record being marked as deleted simply doesn't mean that the user of the device went in and deleted it, something we already know couldn't have happened. So there you have it. Put simply, this report is misleading, especially to forensic examiners who don't understand what the underlying data represents or how that data got there. Now, while this record does provide an indication that a search attempt was made, it's not necessarily connected at all with the timestamp displayed along with it, and I would imagine that a competent forensic examiner would and should be able to do what I've done here after about a week of poking around with zero prior experience doing any kind of forensic analysis. Look at all the surrounding data, understand how the data gets there and what it means, examine multiple unique artifacts from the device as well as the different types of reports from Cellebrite, and piece together exactly what happened from all of the available evidence. Now, unfortunately, while it seems like he has an impressive pedigree and extensive experience in the field, the defense's expert witness, Richard Green, appears not to have done this at all, and I want to briefly explain why I believe this to be the case. First, I want to start off by giving him props for admitting that he was wrong about one particular part of his analysis. In his written report, he examined one of the Cellebrite reports that seemed to indicate that at 6:23:49 that morning, she searched for how long does it take to digest food. Now, what this record actually indicates is that Safari likely took her Hoslong to Die in Cold search query, assumed what she actually meant was how long to digest food, and began prefetching a preview image associated with this search from Apple's CDN, where it stores these type of images. This sort of thing happens all the time when Apple is attempting to do predictive suggestions based on what it thinks you're actually looking for, and is how they're able to show you something like this. Now, Richard Green admitted during his testimony that his assumption was a mistake.
That was something that was a suggestion and not something that was actually searched, correct?
So, yeah, in fairness, I want to give you my best knowledge, as I understand it, saying here today, including after my review of Mr. Whiffen and Ms. Hyde's report. So I want to do everything I can to shine as much light and clarity on this as possible. So as I repeated, since that time and did the search, I would notice that is one of the things that would come up, and it would have a little picture of like a dinner plate or something like that. And there was actually a similar, if not the same picture found in the artifacts of that phone.
And so just to conclude, that's not what you said in your affidavit that was actually filed under pains and penalties of perjury with this court, correct?
Yes, and on that day, that is what my true and proper belief was. Okay, it's since further testing, I have found that I now believe that was probably an automatic one, and if I've caused you any distress, I apologize.
And I believe that admission is quite important here, as it indicates his willingness to make the assumption and come to a conclusion in writing under penalty of perjury that was simply incorrect. He didn't actually look at what the file was, where it came from, or what it represented, something he probably could have figured out in seconds, ironically by doing his own Google search. Looking at the file name itself, it's pretty obvious to anybody who's ever done web development that this artifact likely represents a cached image downloaded from Apple's CDN related to search suggestions. But he very succinctly and matter-of-factly stated in his report that this indicates that Jennifer McCabe made this search at that time, something we know is false. Now, unfortunately, this seems to be the only mistake he acknowledges making, failing to recognize that he basically made the exact same error along with a few others when examining all of the other artifacts related to these searches. Here he says that he quote-unquote observed the following significant artifact from the morning in question, and in this case he's referring to the search items report that we just discussed. Based solely on that singular page output by Cellebrite, he concludes, thus, search history information obtained from Jennifer McCabe's cell phone indicates that the phone's user entered the following search, Hosselong to die in cold. Now, unfortunately, he did absolutely zero analysis to actually come to that conclusion. He clicked a few buttons in Cellebrite, which printed out the search items report, and then based his entire conclusion solely on his misinterpretation of what this report actually represented. Now, he then goes on to say, in order to confirm the accuracy of this search event as reported in Cellebrite, I independently performed a low-level analysis of the artifact found in USF01, which is the WAL file associated with browserstate.db, the exact file that the report he just referenced had printed the details of. And after looking at that database record, he concluded, thus, I was able to independently verify that the time, date, and fact of the search reported in Cellebrite was accurate, which again, we know is false. The Cellebrite report was effectively a less ugly display of the database record, so all he did was open the database himself to check that the data matched what the report said, which is hardly what I would consider a low-level analysis. He simply looked at the same piece of data in two different formats, and then, continuing to misunderstand what the data actually represented, concluded that this validated his initial findings. Now he continues, saying, significantly, the Cellebrite analysis further reveals that the 2:27:40 a.m. search for Hosselong to die in cold was therefore deleted by the user. Now this is merely his assumption based on the column in the Cellebrite report having the title deleted, not actually based on any real understanding of what the data means. And therein lies the fundamental problem. He refers to this document as the Cellebrite analysis, but in reality, Cellebrite is simply a tool to help forensic analysts collect and display data. And they're called analysts for a reason. Their expertise is in interpreting, understanding, and communicating the data that tools like Cellebrite collect. In this case, Richard Green did not do that, and that's made clear by what he says next. The browserstate.db dataset contains information about the open tabs in the Safari application. This allows the user to leave the application and then return at a later time to resume the browsing session. We all know now that that's simply entirely backwards, as evidenced by my earlier demonstration showcasing that the database doesn't even exist until after you close a tab. This dataset doesn't contain information about open tabs, it specifically contains information about tabs that have been closed. And with any amount of testing, he would realize that the information utilized to maintain the data of your open tabs that allows you to quit and return back to resume your browsing has to be stored elsewhere. Because again, you can do all of this in Safari without that database ever existing, and it all still works. Now he then continues, saying, quote, the individual tabs can be deleted by the user. Here, Celebrite indicates that the 2:27:40 a.m. search for Hoss Long to Diane Cold was deleted by the user. Now, I know I'm beating a dead horse, but that's just incorrect. It does indicate that something was deleted, but he simply assumes that that means she manually went in and deleted specifically that search, which is something that you can't really do. And I personally find this quite bizarre, because if he was going to assume anything, I would think that the assumption would be what he literally stated in the sentence prior, that individual tabs can be deleted by the user. If he was going to make a baseless assumption about what the deleted column meant, it actually makes a lot more sense to assume that that was an indication that she closed that tab. Although, even that more reasonable assumption would still have been incorrect, but I digress. Now, finally, he says, quote, "The following artifacts support that the user was interacting with the phone during this period." And then he lists a few events like the phone being unlocked, text messages being sent, etc. I presume he was referencing event data stored in Knowledge C for at least those first 3 events, and have a hunch that he merely added in the last event based on his prior conclusions. But I have no way of verifying the source of this line item because he doesn't actually reference the actual artifacts that he used to make these determinations, or provide any exhibits for this claim anywhere in the report. Now, he finally concludes, "Thus, the data unequivocally establishes that an individual using Jennifer McCabe's iPhone 11 searched Hoss Long to Diane Cold at 2:27:40 a.m. on January 29th, 2022. A conclusion that I've made clear that I don't believe he's justified in coming to. I reached out to Richard Green via email and through his website, but unfortunately received no response." Now, the results of my independent analysis are consistent with both of the Commonwealth's third-party expert witnesses, Jessica Hyde and Ian Whiffen, and it's worth noting something that appears to have been missed by many folks who watched the trial. Ian Whiffen isn't just any old digital forensics guy. Not only does he literally work for Celebrite, but it's basically his job to design these reports and understand how they're generated. It's not just me who determined that the last viewed time value was misleading, and as a result of this and other similar events, Celebrite has literally had to change the way that this specific searched items report is generated, specifically because it was being misinterpreted in exactly the way that Richard Green had done in this case.
We recognize that this timestamp could be misleading. Regardless of how we label that timestamp, the very fact that a timestamp is there, we feel would be or potentially misrepresented. So the decision was taken to remove the timestamp altogether from that information. So now we show the web page was visited, but we don't attribute a time to that purely because it could be wildly inaccurate.
Now, many armchair analysts online have levied the absurd criticism against Mr. Whiffen that his entire testimony was merely an infomercial for his own personal software tool he created that helps analysts do much faster testing and analysis, known as ArtX, with some even attempting to claim that his tool must be bad and it's the reason that his analysis is wrong. Now, this is honestly asinine for multiple reasons, not limited to the fact that his mentioning this software only makes up a tiny fraction of his overall testimony, and that's because it was relevant to his testing and a demonstration that he did literally on the stand. And not only based on the fact that he gives away the software to the digital forensics community for free, but also because of what the opposing expert, Richard Green, had to say here.
Well, I wanted to do a little deeper dive into that, and so I used some various other database specific tools. One was called Belkasoft X, which has an excellent database viewer in it. Sanderson Forensics, which is known to specialize in this type of work, and
ArtX?
I'm sorry?
ArtX?
You saved me. Yes, ArtX, which is a program known in the community for research.
So there you have it. He literally used a tool that Ian Whiffen created to help him with his analysis. Now, Mr. Whiffen also writes a blog, and in 2 lengthy and informative posts outlines the testing and analysis that he did regarding everything I just went over. He outlines all of the idiosyncrasies I discussed and even goes further by explaining the nuances of the various major versions of iOS, extensively analyzing and documenting the similarities and differences between the relevant data and behaviors of each. Every bit of testing I did coincides with all of the conclusions he came to, even down to the smallest of details, like the bizarre inheritance of last viewed timestamps between tabs. And in my opinion, this is the exact kind of thing you need to be able and willing to do to fully understand these concepts at the level required to confidently testify in a murder trial. I understand that many people are very emotionally invested in defending Karen Read and absolutely will reject anything and everything presented by the Commonwealth against her. But that isn't something that should be held against folks like Jessica Hyde and Ian Whiffen. They don't represent the same corrupt establishment that we're trying to fight against here. They aren't arguing whether or not Karen Read is guilty or innocent. They're entirely independent third-party experts that are just sharing their expertise in pursuit of the truth, independent of any of the other facts in this case. What they testified to has no bearing on Karen Read's innocence, so her supporters need to stop vilifying them solely because they're on the quote-unquote wrong side. Now this is so important to me because for anybody who believes Karen Read is innocent and who wants justice, you should be in support of the pursuit of the truth no matter what it is. Accepting or promoting untruths merely because they help support an overall narrative that we do believe is true is exactly the kind of rationalization that can lead to the corruption apparent in this case. Arguing that Jennifer McCabe made that Google search at 2:27 a.m. despite all of the data that actually proves she did not, just because making that argument furthers our belief that Karen Read is innocent, is fundamentally no different than sprinkling pieces of broken taillight on the lawn of 34 Fairview Road just because it furthers your belief that she's guilty. The truth matters. I definitely understand the willingness to instantly assume that anything and everything that Jennifer McCabe says is a lie, but doing so is frankly absurd. She's definitely not a likable or credible witness, but if she testified to something that also happens to be supported by evidence, the evidence should take precedent. And of course, that also doesn't mean that she isn't lying about any or all of the other details. It's the evidence that matters. Now, looking at the overall narrative through a different lens, one that doesn't include Jennifer McCabe having knowledge that John O'Keefe was dying on the Albert's front lawn that morning, actually paints quite a different picture of what likely happened that night. And I would argue that that picture is a far more sober and realistic one than the alternative. Only a handful of people really know what happened that night, and I'm surely not one of them. But not only do I personally find this kind of alternate theory far more plausible, but if this ever goes to retrial and another brand new jury has to weigh the defense's theory of the case versus the Commonwealth's, it's entirely possible that they find this version of the story far more of a reasonable alternative, which I would argue will only help Karen in the end.